My name is Linda, and for most of my life people thought they knew who I was. They thought I was just another woman living quietly in the same little white house on Maple Street, the one with the blue shutters and the wild roses growing up the porch railings. The truth is that house was my whole world. It was where I raised my children, where I lost my husband, and where I learned what it meant to start over when the world around you forgets you exist. I moved into that house with my husband Tom 50 years ago when we were just starting our lives together. He built the porch swing himself, painted the walls with his own hands, and planted an apple tree in the front yard that he said would grow old with us, and he did that tree so everything our first anniversary. Our fights, our children playing barefoot in the yard, our quiet evenings after long days at work, and later it stood silent when I sat alone on that same porch, holding a cup of coffee, staring at the empty chair beside me after Tom passed away. After he was gone, the house started to feel different. It was too big, too quiet, and too full of memories that would wake me at night. Sometimes I would walk from room to room, touching the walls and whispering to him as if he could still hear me. But no matter how much I tried, the silence always won. Still I stayed, because leaving felt like betraying everything we had built. But life has a way of pushing you when you least expect it. One day my doctor told me that my heart wasn't as strong as it used to be. He said I needed less stress, fewer stairs, more rest, and then the roof started leaking, and the furnace gave out during the coldest week of winter, and suddenly that house I loved so much started to feel like a burden I couldn't carry anymore. When I told my kids that I was thinking about selling it, they looked at me like I had lost my mind. My daughter Karen said, "Mom, you can't just sell the house. That's our childhood home." My son Greg said, "It's the only thing Dad left us. You can't give it away." I tried to explain that it wasn't about giving anything away. It was about finally taking care of myself. But they didn't want to hear it. They thought I was being reckless, maybe even selfish. The neighbors started whispering too. They'd see the for sale sign and say things like, "Poor Linda, she's probably lonely. Maybe she's losing her memory." It hurt to hear those words because I wasn't losing my memory. I was finding my courage. Weeks went by and people came to see the house. Some just wanted to look, others made small offers, but none of them felt right. I wanted someone who would love it the way we did, who would see its heart, not just its age. One afternoon, a young couple came to visit. They were polite, but they walked through the rooms, shaking their heads, saying things like, "It needs too much work, and we'd have to tear out the kitchen." It broke my heart to hear that kitchen had held 50 Christmas dinners and hundreds of Sunday breakfasts, but to them, it was just old. After they left, I sat on the porch swing and cried. Margaret, my next-door neighbor, came over with her usual cup of tea. She sat beside me and said, "You don't owe anyone an explanation, Linda. You do what you need to do for yourself." I nodded, but deep down I still wondered if I was doing the right thing. A few weeks later, I got a call from a man named Henry. He said he'd seen the listing and wanted to visit. He sounded kind, so I agreed. When he arrived, I saw that he wasn't young like the others. He was in his late 50s with kind eyes and the sort of calm smile that reminded me of Tom. He walked slowly through the house, touching the banister, tracing the cracks in the walls. And when he reached the living room, he just stood there looking around quietly. He said softly, "This house feels alive." I tilted my head and said, "What do you mean?" He smiled and said, "You can feel the love that's been here. You can feel the stories." Something about the way he said it made my heart ease. For the first time in months, we talked for over an hour. He told me he had grown up nearby and had always loved this street. He said he wanted to make this house his home, but not to change it completely, just to care for it. I didn't say it out loud, but in that moment I knew he was the one. When word spread around town that I had accepted Henry's offer, people started talking even more. Some said I'd made a mistake selling it too cheap. Others said I should have waited for my kids to take over. But my kids hadn't called in weeks, and I was tired of living my life trying to please everyone else. The day I packed my things, the neighbors came by pretending to help, but mostly just watching. They kept asking, "Are you sure you want to do this, Linda? What will you do now? Where will you go?" I smiled politely and said, I'll figure it out. They laughed softly, thinking I was just a confused old lady, starting over too late. When the moving truck pulled away, I stood in the yard one last time. The sun was setting behind the apple tree, casting long shadows across the porch. I whispered, "Goodbye, Tom, and thank you for every day we had." Then I turned and walked down the path without looking back. For the next few weeks, I stayed with Margaret. While I figured out my next step, the town kept buzzing with gossip. Someone said they saw construction trucks at the house. Others said Henry must have been rich and was tearing the place apart. I tried not to listen, but curiosity got the better of me one morning. Margaret handed me the local paper and said, "You might want to see this." On the front page was a picture of my house. It looked exactly the same, only fresher. The porch repainted, the garden blooming again. But what caught my eye wasn't the house, it was the headline, "Community Center opens in historic Maple Street home." I blinked in disbelief. I read further. The article said that Henry wasn't just a buyer, he was part of it. I walked into the center that first day. I was greeted by a group of children playing near the porch swing. One little boy ran up to me and said, "Miss Linda, are you the lady who used to live here?" I smiled and nodded. He grinned wide and said, "This place feels happy because of you." That simple sentence nearly brought tears to my eyes. Inside the kitchen, a young mother named Claire was unpacking groceries. She looked nervous, like she wasn't sure if she belonged. I helped her put things away and asked how she was doing. She told me she had lost her husband in an accident and had been living in her car with her daughter before finding this place. I listened quietly, holding her hand as she spoke. When she finished, she said, "Thank you for listening. No one really listens anymore." Over the next few weeks, I found myself spending more and more time there. I helped cook dinners for the families, taught the kids how to bake apple pie just the way Tom liked it, and sometimes I'd sit on the porch swing, reading stories aloud to whoever wanted to listen. It felt like the house had come alive again. Only this time it wasn't mine alone. It belonged to everyone. One afternoon, Henry stopped by while I was planting flowers by the front steps. He said, "Linda, I think you've become the heart of this place. The families adore you, and honestly, so do we." I laughed and told him I was just doing what anyone would do, but deep down I felt proud. It had been years since anyone had called me needed. That evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I sat on the swing thinking about all the people who had once laughed when I decided to sell my home. They thought I was giving up, but I realized now that I had been giving forward. Sometimes it takes losing something to make room for something bigger. A few days later, my daughter Karen came to visit again. She brought her teenage son Evan with her. He hadn't been back since he was a little boy. When we pulled up to the house, his eyes widened. "Grandma, this is your old house, right? It looks amazing." I smiled and said, "It's everyone's house now, honey." He looked around at the people laughing in the yard, paused, and then added, "If my husband could see this now, I think he'd be proud, because he always believed a home should never stay quiet, it should keep giving." When I finished, the crowd clapped, and a few people wiped their eyes. Henry stepped forward and handed me a small wooden plaque. It read, "In honor of Linda Harper, whose courage to let go gave life to a new beginning." I couldn't speak for a moment. My throat tightened and my eyes filled with tears. After the ceremony, people came to hug me one by one. Each had a story to share, how the center had helped them, how it had given them hope. I listened to every word, feeling something warm and steady growing inside me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel old or forgotten. I felt alive, needed part of something good. That night, after everyone had gone home, Henry and I sat on the porch swing watching the lights twinkle across the yard. He said quietly, "Linda, you know, the funny thing is, people laughed when you sold this house, but now they all want to visit. They say it feels like magic." I smiled and said, "It's not magic, Henry, it's love. That's what makes a place shine even after you leave it." He nodded, then said, "There's one more thing I want to show you." He led me to the living room, where above the fireplace hung a framed photograph. It was an old picture of me and Tom standing on this very porch on the day we moved in. My heart skipped a beat. Henry said, "I found it in the attic. I thought it belonged here forever." I touched the frame with trembling hands, whispering, "Thank you, Henry." As I walked home that night, the stars looked brighter. Somehow the air was cold, but I felt warm inside. I thought about how people often measure life by what they keep, but maybe it should be measured by what they give. Weeks later, as spring returned, the garden bloomed again, just like it used to. The apple tree was heavy with blossoms, and kids played beneath it, laughing so loud that their joy reached every corner of the neighborhood. Whenever someone passed by, they would stop to admire the old house and say, "That's where it all began." One afternoon, I sat beneath that apple tree with little Evan. He asked, "Grandma, do you ever miss living here?" I smiled and said, "Sometimes, but I don't feel far away. It's like the house still knows me." He looked up at the branches and said, "I think it does too." In that moment, I realized something powerful. I had spent years afraid of losing my past, but what I didn't know was that my past was never gone. It had simply changed shape. It was living on in every smile, every meal shared, every heart healed within those walls. As I got up to leave, I looked at the house one last time for the day. The sunlight hit the windows just right, and for a second, I could almost see Tom standing by the door, smiling at me. The wind rustled through the leaves as if whispering, "It's okay, Linda, you did it." And I knew I had. A few months passed since the celebration, and life settled into a gentle rhythm. I spent most mornings at the center, helping where I could, sometimes baking pies with the kids, sometimes sitting with the older ones who had lost their way a little and just needed someone to listen in the evenings. I walked home along the same path I had taken for 50 years. Only now, instead of sadness, I felt peace. One day, Henry told me a reporter wanted to interview me for the local newspaper. She wanted to write about how the old Harper house had become a place of hope. I laughed and told him I wasn't anyone special, but he insisted. So the next afternoon, a young woman named Emily came by. She had bright eyes and a kind smile. She asked me questions about my life, how I decided to sell, and whether I missed it. I told her honestly, yes, sometimes, but letting go was the bravest and best thing I ever did. When the article came out, the headline read, "The House That Heals." My phone started ringing non-stop. Old friends, neighbors, even strangers wanted to talk. They said my story made them cry, that it gave them courage to start over or forgive someone or finally take a risk they had been too afraid to take. One woman wrote me a letter saying she had been holding on to her late husband's store for years, afraid to sell it. But after reading my story, she donated it to a youth program. She said, "You reminded me that love doesn't live in walls, it lives in what we do with them." Hearing that filled my heart in ways I can't describe. For so long, I'd felt like an ordinary old woman living quietly in a small town. But suddenly I realized that even the smallest choice can ripple out and touch lives we never meet. One morning, while I was tending to the garden, a man in a crisp suit walked up to me. He introduced himself as Daniel. He said he worked for a foundation that supported community projects. He had read the article and wanted to visit the house for himself. He said, "Linda, this place is special. I can feel it." He walked through every room, carefully taking notes and photos. Then he turned to me and said, "How would you feel if we helped you expand this center so even more families could find a home?" My eyes widened. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Henry and I looked at each other in shock. Daniel smiled and said, "The world needs more places like this and more people like you." Within months, plans began taking shape. A small extension was built, adding more rooms and a learning space for children. The day it opened, I stood by the doorway, watching as new families arrived, carrying boxes and holding their children's hands. Each one had a story of pain and hope, and I welcomed them the way I would have welcomed guests into my own home. The community began to grow around it. Businesses started donating supplies. Teenagers volunteered to tutor the little ones. And sometimes on weekends, we held small gatherings where everyone shared food and music. It was like watching a seed bloom into a field of wildflowers. But even in all this happiness, there were quiet moments when I still missed Tom. I missed hearing his voice at night, the way he'd hum while fixing the old porch steps. Sometimes I'd sit by the apple tree and talk to him softly, telling him about all that had happened. I'd say, "Tom, they laughed when I sold it, but now look at it, it's alive again." I swear sometimes I can hear him in the wind whispering, "I told you so." One autumn evening, as the leaves began to turn golden, I was helping a young boy named Mason with his homework. He looked up at me and asked Miss Linda, "Why do you help everyone all the time?" I smiled and said, "Because when people helped me, I found light again." He thought for a moment, then said, "I want to be like you when I grow up." I had to look away so he wouldn't see my tears. A few weeks later, Henry told me he had nominated me for a community service award. I laughed and told him I didn't need a medal, but he said, "It's not for you, it's for what you've started." So I went to the ceremony wearing the same blue dress. Tom loved when they called my name and people stood clapping. I felt something deep inside me shift. It wasn't pride exactly. It was gratitude, the kind that fills your chest until you can hardly breathe. When I walked up to receive the award, I said simply, "This doesn't belong to me. It belongs to everyone who ever believed that one good act can change a life, because that's what this house did. It changed mine, and it keeps changing others." The crowd went quiet. Then a woman in the front row whispered, "Amen," and I smiled through my tears. After the ceremony, people came up to talk and share their own stories of loss. And starting over, a man said he had been estranged from his daughter for years, but after hearing about the Harper house, he called her again. He said, "Sometimes you need to see kindness to remember how to be kind." That sentence stayed with me. Winter came again, and with it the quiet beauty of snow. The old porch was wrapped in lights, and laughter echoed from the windows. I spent Christmas Eve at the center, surrounded by people who once had no one to share the holiday with. We sang carols, drank cocoa and told these stories long into the night as the clock struck midnight. I looked around and thought to myself, this is what love looks like. As I stepped outside into the snow, I saw Karen and Evan walking toward me. They had driven in from the city to surprise me. Karen hugged me tight and whispered, "Mom, you've built something beautiful." I smiled and said, "No, honey, we all did." Evan looked up at the house with its glowing windows and said, "Grandma, this place feels alive." I nodded and said, "It is because love never dies. It just finds new walls to live in." Later that night, as everyone said their goodbyes, I stood alone under the apple tree, snow falling softly around me. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you to the wind. Thank you for giving me courage when I thought I had none. Thank you for showing me that every ending hides a beginning." When I opened my eyes, I saw something shining in the snow. It was the small brass key to my old house. I had kept it all this time without really knowing why. I knelt down, picked it up, and smiled. I decided right then that I would place it in a glass frame and hang it by the front door of the center with a small note that said, "This key opened one door but helped unlock 1,000 hearts." The next morning, Henry found me doing just that. He looked at the frame and said, "That's perfect, Linda." I said, "It's a reminder, Henry. Sometimes when we let go of what we think we need, we make room for miracles." He smiled quietly, then said, "You know, people used to laugh when you sold your house, but now they cry every time they walk through its doors because they can feel what you left behind." I laughed softly and said, "Then I guess it was worth every tear." That afternoon, the sun broke through the winter clouds, lighting up the house in a golden glow. Children ran across the yard, their laughter ringing like music, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it should be. I knew then that no matter what came next, I had already lived a life full of meaning. I turned toward the sky and whispered softly, "Tom, you were right. Home isn't where we live, it's what we give." Spring came early that year. The air felt softer, the light brighter, and everything seemed touched by hope. The garden at the center bloomed faster than usual, as if the earth itself knew it had found a purpose again. I spent my mornings among the tulips, trimming the hedges, watering the young saplings, and talking with the families who had now become like an extended family to me. One morning, while I was picking flowers, a familiar car pulled up by the curb. I shaded my eyes from the sun. As a man stepped out, my breath caught for a moment, because even after so many years, I recognized him. It was my brother James. We had not spoken in almost 15 years, not since the bitter argument. After Tom's funeral, I froze, unsure whether to smile or retreat. But before I could decide, he called softly, "Linda." His voice cracked on my name. I felt my heart twist with memories of childhood summers, of shared laughter, of fights that never really mattered, until the one that did. I walked toward him slowly and said, "You look older, James." He smiled sadly and said, "So do you, but you look happier." We stood there in silence for a while before he said, "I read about you in the paper, the house, the families, this place." He looked around, taking it all in, then said, "I came to say I'm sorry I was wrong back then. I was angry and lonely, and I took it out on you." The words hit me like sunlight after a long storm. I had waited so many years to hear them, but now that they were here, I didn't feel anger, only relief. I said softly, "I was stubborn too. I should have called you sooner." He nodded and said, "Maybe we both had to learn forgiveness the hard way." We walked through the garden together. I showed him the new rooms, the library, the kitchen where I taught the kids to bake pie. He touched the walls gently and said, "You turned grief into grace, Linda." "I don't know how you did it." I said, "Neither do I. Maybe because I stopped fighting what was gone and started loving what was left." That evening we sat on the porch swing just like old times. The air was cool and the stars were coming out one by one. James told me about his life, his regrets, how after his wife passed he realized how much family mattered. He said, "I thought about coming sooner, but I didn't think you'd want to see me." I looked at him and said, "You're my brother James. I'll always want to see you." When he left that night, he hugged me tighter than he ever had before and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I watched his car disappear down the street, and I felt something deep inside finally heal. Forgiveness had taken years, but it had come quietly like spring after a long winter. Over the next few months, James started visiting often. He helped fix small things around the center, built a new swing set for the children, and even started teaching woodworking classes. The kids adored him, calling him Uncle James. Sometimes I'd watch him laughing with them and think about how strange life is, how the same people who once broke your heart can later help you heal it. One evening we held a small gathering at the center to celebrate the 5th anniversary of its opening. Families came with food, music, and laughter. The air was filled with the smell of grilled corn and blooming flowers. Henry gave a short speech thanking everyone, then surprised me by saying, "We wouldn't be here without Linda's courage to let go and her brother's hands that helped us rebuild." Everyone clapped, and I felt tears slip down my cheeks. As the night went on, I sat quietly on the porch, watching the lights dance in the trees. I thought about the day I sold the house, how everyone laughed and whispered behind my back, saying I was foolish. But now, as I looked around at the joy filling every corner of this place, I realized that sometimes what people call foolish is really faith. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in the mail from the city council. They wanted to recognize the center as a local heritage site, to preserve its story and ensure its work continued for generations. My hands shook. As I read it, I showed it to Henry and James, and they both grinned like proud children. It felt like the house had come full circle from a place of personal memory to a symbol of community hope. The day the officials came to present the plaque, it seemed the whole town turned up, even the mayor was there. Cameras clicked, people cheered, and as they unveiled the sign, "The Harper Home for Hope," I couldn't stop crying. It was like Tom and everyone I had ever loved was standing there with me smiling. After the ceremony, I walked through the house alone for a few minutes, touching the walls that had held so many lives. I whispered softly, "Thank you for holding us all." I thought about the families who had come and gone, the children who had grown taller, the ones who had found jobs and moved into homes of their own. Every goodbye had been bittersweet, but every story was proof that this house had become what it was always meant to be, a shelter for hearts in need. Later that night, I sat under the apple tree again. James joined me, carrying 2 cups of tea. He said, "You know, I think Tom would be proud of you." I smiled and said, "I think he's been proud all along." He nodded, then said, "And Mom and Dad too, you kept the family spirit alive, even when it felt broken." I said softly, "Maybe that's what love really is, James, not just holding on, but keeping the light burning so others can find their way." The crickets sang around us, and the night air was thick with the scent of spring blossoms. We sat there in silence, content and full. The moon hung low and golden like a gentle, watchful eye. I closed my eyes, and for a moment it felt like everything in my life had led to this peace, this calm after so many storms. A week later, Henry told me that a national organization had noticed our story. They wanted to feature the Harper Home for Hope in a documentary about communities that changed lives through kindness. I couldn't believe The thought of sharing our small town story with the world felt overwhelming but also beautiful. Henry said, "Linda, this could inspire so many more people," and I smiled because I knew he was right. When the camera crew came, they spent days filming. They talked to the families, to James, to Henry, and to me. They asked me what kept me going through loss and laughter and all the changes. I told them simply because kindness always finds a way back home. The day the documentary aired, people from across the country began sending letters and emails. Some wanted to volunteer, others wanted to start their own community homes inspired by ours. One message from a woman in another state said, "I was about to give up on everything until I watched your story. You reminded me that one act of courage can change the world." That message made me cry harder than I had in years. One evening, after the excitement settled, I sat on the porch swing again, holding a letter from a man I didn't know. He wrote that he had been one of those who laughed when I sold my house years ago. He said I was wrong. "You showed me that love doesn't fade. When walls change hands, it grows," I whispered. "Thank you," into the quiet air, feeling the peace of a full heart. That night before I went to bed, I walked through the house one more time. Lights twinkled outside, children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. I stopped by the fireplace where the photograph of me and Tom hung and whispered softly, "We did it, love. The house is still full, and so am I." It was a quiet morning in early summer. The air felt heavy with warmth, and the garden buzzed with the sound of bees drifting lazily between the flowers. I was sitting on the porch swing, sipping my coffee, when I saw a car pull up slowly near the gate. It wasn't anyone I recognized. The door opened and a woman stepped out. She looked to be in her 40s, tall, with kind but tired eyes. She hesitated for a moment before walking toward me, holding a small envelope in her hands. She said softly, "Are you Mrs. Linda Harper?" I nodded. She smiled faintly and said, "My name is Rebecca. I don't think we've ever met, but I knew your husband, Tom." The cup nearly slipped from my hand. I hadn't heard that name spoken by a stranger in years. I motioned for her to sit down. She did, her hands trembling a little. She looked nervous, like someone carrying a story they weren't sure they should tell. She said, "I met Tom a long time ago when I was working as a nurse. He was one of my patients for a while. During his last months," I froze, listening carefully. She continued, "He talked about you every single day. He used to say that you were the best part of his life, that he worried about leaving you alone. He made me promise something before he passed. He told me that if I ever got the chance, I should visit you and tell you something." My throat tightened. "What was it?" I asked. She looked me straight in the eyes and said, "He told me to tell you to live again. He said you would want to keep everything the same after he was gone, but that wasn't what he wanted. He said, please tell Linda that home isn't where I am. Home is where she keeps loving others." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The words hit me like sunlight through clouds. Rebecca reached into her bag and handed me the envelope. Inside was a letter in Tom's handwriting. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The paper was yellowed a little and the ink slightly faded, but his writing was still strong. It read, "My dearest Linda, if you're reading this, it means you found a way to smile again, or at least you're trying. I want you to know how proud I am of you for every kindness, every laugh, every tear you've shared with the world. You were my home, you still are. Don't hide from life. Don't lock your heart inside these walls. Promise me you'll keep giving love, even when it hurts. That's how we stay alive." I couldn't hold back the tears. I read it over and over until the words blurred together. Rebecca sat quietly beside me, giving me space. When I finally looked up, she said, "He believed in you more than anyone I've ever met." I took her hand and whispered, "Thank you for bringing him back to me today." She smiled and said, "I think he never really left you." We sat there for a while, watching the sunlight dance across the garden. I told her about the center, about how I sold the house, how people had laughed. but now it had become something beautiful. She listened with tears in her eyes and said he would have loved this. He would have said, "See, Linda, you always find the light." Before she left, she gave me a small wooden box. She said, "Tom wanted me to give you this too. When the time was right, I opened it slowly. Inside was a tiny brass compass, the kind he used to carry when we went hiking together on the back. It was engraved with the words, 'Follow love, it will always lead you home.'" After she drove away, I sat holding that compass for a long time, feeling the weight of it in my palm. I realized that even in death, Tom had found a way to guide me one more time. That evening, I gathered everyone at the center in the main hall. I told them about Rebecca, about the letter, about Tom's message. I held up the compass and said, "My husband left me a reminder to follow love." And I think that's what this house is all about, following love. It's what led each of us here. People clapped softly and some wiped away tears. Later that night, I walked through the garden under the soft glow of string lights. I felt him with me in every rustle of leaves, in every whisper of the wind. I said quietly, "You were right, Tom." It wasn't about holding on, it was about giving on. The next day, something amazing happened. A young woman named Sarah, who had grown up in the center, came back to visit. She had been one of the first children to live there years ago. She was now in college studying to be a social worker. She hugged me tightly and said, "Miss Linda, you changed my life. I want to open a center just like this one someday. I want to help people like you helped me." I felt my heart swell with pride and love. I told her that's all I ever wanted, honey, for love to keep going long after I'm gone. She smiled and said it already has. Over the next week, Sarah began volunteering again, helping the kids with homework, organizing events. She reminded me so much of myself when I was younger. Full of hope and stubborn light, watching her made me realize how everything had come full circle. I had once been the one giving, now I was watching the next generation carry that torch forward. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Henry and James joined me for dinner. We sat outside laughing, sharing stories about the past. James looked around the lively yard and said, "Do you realize, Linda, that your house has become the heart of this whole town? People come here not just for help, but for hope." Henry nodded and added, "You planted a seed and now it's a forest." I looked at both of them and smiled. When I sold this place, people thought I had lost my mind. But maybe sometimes you have to lose what you love to find what the world needs. They both went quiet for a moment and then raised their glasses to love that never ends. As night fell, we watched the children chase fireflies across the grass, their laughter echoing through the air. And I thought to myself, this is what eternity feels like. It's not forever in years, it's forever in moments like these, when love keeps circling back. Later that night, as I was closing up the house, I placed the compass on the mantel beneath our old photograph. I whispered softly, "Thank you, Tom, for believing in me, for showing me the way." And somewhere in the stillness, I could almost hear his voice in the wind saying, "You did just fine, my love. You did just fine." Years passed like pages in a book, quietly, gently, one blending into the next. The town changed, children grew up, streets got busier, stores opened and closed, but the little house that had once been mine now stood strong and alive more than ever. It wasn't just a home anymore. It had become a place where here found shelter and where broken souls learned to breathe again. I had grown older, but I never felt lonely. The laughter of children still filled my mornings, and the kindness of strangers still warmed my evenings. Sometimes I would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the volunteers come and go, thinking about how far everything had come from that one painful day when I decided to sell my house. People once laughed at me, but now they came to visit with respect and gratitude in their eyes. There were days when I'd walk through the garden and remember all the moments that had shaped my life, the laughter of my son when he was small, the sound of Tom's voice calling me in for supper, the rustle of leaves as I cried alone after losing everything. Every single sound, every memory had become part of this soil. It was as if love had rooted itself deep beneath the house and kept it alive long after time had passed. One afternoon I was sitting on the porch. When Henry came by, his face glowing with news, he said, "Linda, guess what? The town council wants to honor you. They want to name the community center after you, the Linda Harper Hope Home." I just stared at him, my heart full to the brim. I said, "Oh no, Henry, I didn't do all this for recognition." He smiled and said, "I know you didn't, that's why you deserve it." That evening the whole town gathered for the ceremony. There were people of all ages, young and old, former residents of the center, families, friends, even strangers, who had once been helped by a meal or a kind word. I stood on the small wooden stage, clutching the compass in my hand, and said softly into the microphone, "I once thought losing my home meant losing my life, but sometimes you have to let go of what's yours so others can find what's theirs." I didn't build this place alone. Every smile, every helping hand, every prayer built it with me. The crowd clapped, some cried, and for the first time in years, I felt something deep in my soul settle peacefully. I had finally come home again, not to a building, but to a purpose. After the ceremony, Sarah found me and hugged me tight. She whispered, "You changed my whole life, Miss Linda. I wouldn't be here without you." I smiled and said, "One day you'll change someone else's life too." That's how love works. It never stops moving. As years went on, my steps grew slower, but my heart never lost its warmth. Every day I'd write a little journal about the people I met, the lives I saw bloom in that home. There was a young mother who came with nothing but left with hope. A boy who grew up and became a teacher. A woman who learned to forgive herself. After years of pain, those stories became my treasures. One winter evening, when the snow began to fall outside, I sat by the fireplace holding that same compass, running my fingers over the words, "Follow love, it will always lead you home." I smiled, remembering Tom, and whispered, "I followed it every step, didn't I? I think you'd be proud." That night, I fell asleep, peacefully surrounded by the gentle crackle of the fire and the sound of laughter drifting from the next room. When morning came, Sarah found me still sitting there wrapped in a blanket, her eyes filled with tears, yet her lips trembling into a small smile. She said quietly, "She looks happy, peaceful, like she's finally resting." The town mourned me with love, but celebrated me with light. They filled the garden with candles that night. Each flame flickered like a story, like a thank you, like a heartbeat. They sang songs, laughed, shared stories, and promised to keep the place alive forever. Months later, Sarah officially took over the home. She became the new heart of it, and she hung my compass in the main hall right above the doorway, so that every person who walked in could see the words that guided my life. She would tell new residents, "This house was built on courage and love from a woman who lost everything but gave everything." She believed that when you follow love, you always find your way back home. Years later, newspapers would write about it, calling it the miracle house that healed the town. But to those who knew me, it was just Miss Linda's place, the home where kindness never ran out. Sometimes on quiet nights, the volunteers say they can still feel my presence. When they walk through the halls, a soft warmth, like someone whispering, "You're safe here. You're loved here. Keep going." And maybe, just maybe, that's true, because love never really leaves. It just changes rooms. So yes, they laughed when I sold my house, but they cried when they saw who bought it, because what I sold wasn't just a home. It was my heart, my legacy, and my promise to the world that kindness never dies. And in that little house on Maple Street, where laughter still dances through the windows and hope still blooms, in every corner my story lives on, forever carried by every soul who walks through its doors. The end.